I want to welcome you to our 9th lecture of church history. We're going to go over one of my favorite periods in history. In America, it's called the Great Awakening. In England, it was called the Evangelical Awakening. But boy, it was a time when God moved in a way that I long to see him move again. We're covering basically the years from 1730 through about 1760. And our country won't be the same after this, and England won't be the same after this. By the time you get to the year 1700, the initial fire of the Reformation was pretty much dying out. One of the things I think we'd all have to admit, it's hard for the second and third generation, after a genuine move of God, to maintain that freshness in their hearts. So in America, all churches were declining by 1720. In 1700, less than 10% of Americans attended church at all. Many pastors, because they'd seen people basically walk away from God, get caught up in life, this country that was founded as a Christian country that was no longer the passion, they began to preach a genre of sermons called Jeremiads. That was based on the old prophet Jeremiah, who preached Israel's funeral and basically talked about how you've gone far from God and God's going to judge. And so by the time you get to 1700, 1720, pastor after pastor went to the pulpit and said, this country's gone so far down. We've got so much sin now, so little care for God. And that was the content of the sermons, and nothing was changing. Can I just chase a little rabbit here? I think we're tempted to do that same kind of preaching today. To go back and say, look what we've lost in our lifetime, and look how far we've come down. And if all we do is go to the pulpit and say it's bad and we've gone far away from God, that will not bring a nation back to God. But let me tell you what happened. Now, as bad as it was in America, folks, it was worse in England. By the time you get to 1700, the morals were weak in England, divorce was rampant. Immorality was fashionable. Fathers taught their sons the art of seduction. The plays were bawdy. There was an addiction that was sweeping England because they developed a cheap way to produce alcohol. It was called gin, and it actually got the nickname the gin craze. And anywhere you go, you could find cheap alcohol, and so alcoholism was destroying the nation. In fact, once in the early 1700s, they dismissed Parliament and sent them home because nobody was sober. They said, y'all just go on, you're not doing any good. It sounds like today, doesn't it? The churches were weak in England. Less than 10% attended church in England, but in America. But in England, less than 1% of the people attended church by the year 1700. But if they went to church, they wouldn't have heard the gospel. Basically what had happened is the preachers in the pulpits were preaching a moralism. They were basically saying, you just need to go out there and be better people. I've heard it summed up this way. There were nice men telling nice people they need to be nicer. Thomas Carlyle visited every church in London. He said he could not find one that gave any distinctive fact of the gospel in any church he attended. It was just that do-goodism that was preached in the pulpit. But then another reason why people didn't go to church, the poor couldn't afford to go to church. The way the churches made their budget was this. They would rent their pews for a 1-year pew rent. Can you imagine that? And so in other words, if you could not pay the price to rent a pew for an entire year, you'd have no pew to sit on. And even if that family wasn't there, nobody could sit on that pew because that was rented by that person or that family. So the poor had no church to go to. If they'd gone to church, they probably wouldn't have understood the sermons because the sermons were very intellectual, using very big words that a common person wouldn't have understood. So here we are at a dark time. And folks, this is one of the things I think ought to encourage us. In the darkest moments, God can break in and bring a great revival. Well, the first peak of revival, the first little bit, a taste of revival actually happened in Europe among the Lutherans. The Lutherans, by the time you get to 1700, had spent the last couple of hundred years arguing over how you express the faith. They were all about head knowledge and doctrinal statements, but they had lost that personal relationship with the Lord. And so there was a movement called the Pietist Movement that began. There was a man named Philip Spener who all over Germany began to organize people into home prayer meetings. And they began to have that touch of God come in those home settings. Another man named Frankie, Franke, formed a university at Howe to produce people who had a real relationship with God. But the epitome of the movement of God, of the Pietism, happened in Moravia with a landed count named Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf had a lot of property, and you've got to understand, at this time, there were still state churches all over Europe. So if you did not agree 100% with that church and said, I can't go to the state church, you could be persecuted, you could be put in prison, your property could be taken away. So even though there were parts that were Protestant, parts that were Catholic, there still was no freedom. So Zinzendorf let it be known that if you're one of the persecuted minority Protestants, you can come and live on my land. He thought it would become a place of heaven on earth, but what he found was the opposite. Because all these groups that had objected to doctrine in their state churches, they came and formed their little groups, and then they spent all of their time, one group arguing with another. And so there was no peace in his land. So finally he said, that's enough. He gave out an order that for the next 2 weeks, no one is allowed to talk about anything but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. If there's a sermon in any of your chapels, it must be on Jesus Christ and Him crucified. If you have a devotion in your family, it must be on Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And then after 2 weeks of focusing on the cross, he said, let's meet together and have a communion service. And when they met, the Spirit of God fell on them. It was an incredible revival. In fact, for over 100 years, they started a 24-hour prayer meeting that never ended for over 100 years. But they also, here, they came to know the Lord personally. They began to send out missionaries who would begin to talk to people about going from head knowledge to say, have you put your faith? Do you know the Lord? Do you know that you have salvation? They went to places like Greenland and reached the Eskimos for Christ. They especially targeted America. A group of them came to Old Salem in North Carolina and formed what is now the city of Winston-Salem, the Moravian Brethren. Well, meanwhile, back in England, God decided to do something through two people, John Wesley and George Whitefield. Wesley's father was a Church of England pastor. England had very much a class structure in that day and time. His father was highly educated, so they would have been considered to be a part of the upper class. He made his way and went to Oxford. He was actually the 15th child of his mother and father. His brother Charles, the great hymn writer, was the 18th child. She basically, for 19 years, had a baby a year. Now, only 9 of those lived. But this mama, Susanna, was extraordinary. What she did was in the midst of taking care of a household, remember, no microwaves in that day and time, she found time to spend 1 hour individually with every one of her children to give them personal tutoring. By the time they were 5, they could read and write English, Latin, and Greek. But she also was very strict. She also made it clear by the time they were 5, they could never cry again and that there'd be no laughter in her house. I think what happened is John Wesley found his personality, he became dysfunctional because of that rigidness. Never in his life did he allow himself a moment of laughter or to do something just for himself because of that kind of stern discipline. Well, he and his brother Charles went off to Oxford. Very few students at Oxford had any heart for God. So they together formed a club with just a handful of other people that they called the Holy Club. Here was an unholy university, so they had a group of people who were determined to be holy, and they had definite disciplines. They fasted during the daylight hours 2 days a week, and they didn't just fast to fast. They fasted so they could take the money they would have spent on food that day and give it to the poor. They went to communion every single day. They spent hours in prayer. They also, in that particular time in England, the death penalty was given out for the smallest offenses. So there were always a group of people awaiting to be executed every week. They would go once a week and go preach to the prisoners on death row. So that was the kind of discipline that they had. Now later on, another man joined them, but he was from the lower strata of society. His name was George Whitefield. His parents were tavern owners. At 5 years of age, he was the one that got the mop and cleaned up after the drunks. Well, Oxford always allowed for a certain number of poor students to come, but here's the catch. If you got one of those poor person's scholarship, that meant in order to receive the scholarship, they would assign you to one of the upper class students, and you would become their personal servant during your stay. So George Whitefield basically went on a work study. He became a servant of an upper class student, but he got to go to Oxford. He joined in with them. Well, after Wesley was finished with college, a man named Oglethorpe had gotten permission from the king to start a new colony in Georgia. There was a real problem in England. If a person owed a debt, they would be put in debtor's prison, which was an unending thing, because if you're in prison, how can you pay your debts? So the prisons were being filled with prisoners who were debtor prisoners. So Oglethorpe said, I think we can solve this. Give us some land at the southern extreme of where your colonies are. We'll start a new colony, and we'll simply empty the jail of debtors with their families, and we'll go over there, give them all a piece of land, and we'll start a new colony for you. Well, Oglethorpe asked Wesley to go as the chaplain for this new colony, and he was excited. He was going to do two things. He was going to win the Indians to Christ, and he was going to turn this new colony into a holy club, a colony where everybody lived by these disciplines. Now, this is a colony founded with people right out of prison. You can imagine how well that went over. So he got on the boat to go. While he was on that boat, he met Moravian missionaries. They began to ask him questions like, do you know that you have a place in heaven? Do you know for certain that you are saved? And he would say to them, I hope one day I will go to heaven. I hope I'll be worthy of it one day. They said, that's not good enough. And then they went through a huge storm. And while everyone, including Wesley, was panicking because they thought they were going to die, he looked over there, and with peace on their faces, they were just singing hymns through the storm. He never forgot those Moravians. Well, he went there. He tried to turn a colony full of prisoners into a holy club. That didn't work well. So what he did was, while he was there, he fell in love with a girl named Sophie Hopke. And he proposed to Sophie Hopke, but she soon realized she had made a mistake. And so she broke off the engagement, was proposed to by another man, and they married. And when she married another person, here he is the pastor of the only church in the colony. He put them under church discipline and refused to serve her communion. So she sued him for defamation of character. Now that was a serious charge in the 1700s. He knew that he could be put in prison, but because of this charge, so in the dark of night, he left Savannah, made his way to Charleston, got on a boat, and went back to England. He wrote in his journal that I went to Georgia to save the Indians, but who will save my soul? He was a complete failure. So when he got back to London, he looked up the Moravian Brethren. They had a home Bible study on Aldersgate Street, and he began to meet with them. He and Charles began to meet. There was a man named Peter Bowler who was one of their leaders, and he spent time going through the gospel of salvation by faith alone, that you can be born again and you can know it. And they came to the point where both of them were convinced that this is true, but they also knew they'd not experienced it themselves. Now here's the irony. Both of them are Church of England preachers. So they said to Peter, what should we do? We know that this is the gospel, but we've not experienced it ourselves. And Peter Bowler gave them an interesting statement. He said, what you do is you preach faith until you have it, and then because you have it, then you'll preach it. So that week they went to the prison and they preached the gospel that you can be saved at this moment and that you can know at this moment that you've got a place in heaven. And they led one of the prisoners on death row to Christ, and he was gloriously saved. The peace of God came on him. There was an instant change. That week they returned so they could get in the cart with him as he was being taken to the public execution. And while along the way, that prisoner simply witnessed. He said, "Don't you worry about me. I'm on my way to heaven. I know where I'm going. My soul is secure. I'll pray for you, but you don't worry about me." And Charles Wesley wrote in his journal that I would give anything to have been able to trade places with him. I would be willing to go be hung if I could have the certainty of salvation that he had. Well, shortly after that, John Wesley was attending that Aldersgate home group with the Moravians, and they were reading some of Luther's writings, and this is what he wrote that night in his journal. "I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation. And that was the point where he was born again. And then he began to preach it with a fervency." Now, the problem was the other preachers in the Church of England were preaching this moralism. They weren't preaching the gospel. They weren't talking about being born again because they hadn't been born again themselves. So what happened is the churches that were previously open for him to preach were shut. So he found himself with nowhere that he could preach. Now, George Whitefield had, just before this, become a Christian on his own. He was reading Puritan books, and he saw that salvation is by faith alone. In his own room one night, he called out for God to save him, and he was gloriously saved. Well, Whitefield was visiting the town of Bristol in England. Bristol was a center of coal mining. He happened to be walking where the coal mines came out after work one evening, and he watched as thousands of coal miners came out. They had the black coal dust on their faces, and his heart broke for him. These are people that didn't know the gospel, had no church to go to. So he went on a hill with his Church of England cassock on, dressed like a preacher. And he began with that big voice he had and began to preach. And everybody looked up and said, "This is strange." And most of them had never heard a preacher in person themselves. So they just gathered around him. And as he preached, the Holy Spirit worked in their hearts. And they said there were white rivers that went through the black coal dust on their faces from the tears that went down their faces. And he called them to put their faith in Christ and said, "I'll meet you tomorrow morning an hour before you go into the mines." And so he began to meet them and gathered a crowd of 20,000 people that met him in the morning before they dispersed and went to all the coal mines to go after the coal. Well, the problem that Whitefield had was he had promised Oglethorpe that he would replace John Wesley and become the chaplain for that new colony of Georgia. And he had a ticket and a date when he had to leave for Georgia. But he had all of these new Christians that he had to take care of. So he sent word to his friend John and said, "You've got to come up here. I've got people that have come to know Christ and they need to be taken care of." Now, John was high church. That was the way he was raised. When he heard of this, he said in his journal, "I should have thought it to be a sin for a soul to be saved outside of a consecrated building." Then he stood there by him. He said, as he was preaching, "I thought to myself, I've never seen anything more vile than this." But he watched as the Holy Spirit worked in that crowd. And he said in his journal that night, "From then on, I determined to be as vile as he." They had found the method that would bring the gospel to that generation in England and America. It was open air preaching. That way they could reach everybody. Now, Wesley was under 5 foot tall, so he always carried a stool and would stand on top of a stool. Whitefield would just find a hill and preach. But they went all over England, and then Whitefield went to America. And when he came to America, there were a few beginning fires of revival that had just started burning in America. Probably the first fire of revival happened in New York City among a Dutch Reformed congregation led by Theodore Frelinghuysen. And what he did was he began to preach, "You must be born again." He required his members to share a testimony of their born again experience before he'd let them take communion. And as they began to look into their own souls, they became born again, and God brought a revival to New York there in that pocket. There were 2 Presbyterian pastors, William and Gilbert Tennant. And they had a burden because most of their fellow Presbyterians were moralistic preachers. In fact, they wrote a sermon that was printed that became very unpopular called "The Danger of the Unconverted Ministry." And they were so burdened by how many unsaved preachers they were that they started their own seminary They called it the Log Cabin College. It's called Princeton University today. So they could produce born-again pastors. In Northampton, in Massachusetts, a man named Jonathan Edwards saw God do an incredible work in his town. As he preached, you must be born again. A town that it was cold toward God, especially the young people were very cold toward God. All of a sudden, God moved in, and the young people led the way, being on fire for God. And that entire town was transformed. So he wrote a book about it, and this was the title. They had long titles in that day and time. A faithful narrative of the surprising work of God and the conversion of many hundreds of souls in Northampton. But it was a bestseller, and people all over the colonies were reading about what God had done in changing a town, Northampton, and they were in their hearts crying out, God, do it in my town, do it in my town. And that's when Whitfield arrived. Well, when Whitfield came to Georgia, he saw a need that God put on his heart. In those days, as hard as it was, there were people who came over and the parents would die and leave orphaned children. There was nobody to take care of them. So he founded an orphanage in Georgia, but the problem was this. It takes money to put food on the table and clothes on their backs and to house them. So he had to take off and started from the southernmost colony, Georgia, and work his way to the northernmost, and he decided to preach and then raise money for the orphanage. But what God did with this great gospel preacher, as he moved through the colonies, all those little pockets of fire over here and there, it was like he was fanning the flame, and the whole thing caught fire. And so God so swept into America that from the years 1740 to 1742, the church membership in America in just those 2 years doubled. By the time this period of time is over, by the time you get to 1760, 3 out of 4 people in America had been moved closer to God through the Great Awakening. It was literally a national revival. Well, there was a break between Wesley and Whitfield. Wesley was someone who did not like Calvinism. He hated the doctrine of predestination. George Whitfield, because he had been led to Christ by reading Puritan books, was somebody who identified as a Calvinist. He believed strongly in predestination. They knew they disagreed on this subject, but they had a gentleman's agreement that they would simply not bring that up. They would concentrate on the gospel and leading people to Christ. Well, while George Whitfield was in America, John Wesley broke that agreement. He published a sermon, and it was I'm telling you, I've read the sermon. It was hot under the collar. He basically condemned the doctrine of predestination. He said at the end of it, I don't want any part of a God who would in advance say, you're going to heaven and you're going to hell and you have no choice about that. So he condemned predestination. Well, this made George Whitfield very uncomfortable because everybody knew he believed in that teaching. So for 2 years, they didn't speak to each other. And so for 2 years, there were actually 2 Methodist movements. There was a Calvinist movement led by George Whitfield, and there was the non-Calvinist movement that was led by John Wesley. And the truth of the matter is, the larger one was Whitfield's version because Whitfield was the greatest preacher of the 1700s. So he had far more followers than Wesley did. But after 2 years, Whitfield assessed his own soul, and he came to this conclusion that his gift was evangelism, and John Wesley's gift was in taking care of souls. So they reunited, came together, and he basically said, John, I'm giving you all of my followers, and you'll be in charge of the Methodist movement, and I'm going to be free to just go and preach. And what John did was he organized these new Christians. We would call it today, he discipled them. And people say the reason why England was saved from a French Revolution, the way that France received it, was because they were changed through these things that John Wesley did in taking these new converts and helping them grow in the Lord. Let me give you his innovations that John Wesley had. First of all, he organized new believers into 3 groups. When he would come to a town, he would take everybody that had been born again through that ministry in the town, and he formed them into a society. And that was not a church because this was a parachurch movement. So they would not meet on Sunday morning, but they would meet once during the week. They would sing rousing hymns, oftentimes written by Charles Wesley. They would hear a good sermon. They would be exhorted. By being in a big group, you saw you're not alone. But then he divided everybody up into classes. And the classes would be 20 to 24 people. They would be co-ed. And in the classes, they would live out the faith together. They would do their Christian service. They would encourage one another. They would stand by each other. But then he went even farther than that, and he sex segregated those classes and would take 6 to 12 men and put them in a group, and 6 to 12 women. He called them bands. And the whole purpose of these bands was once a week, they would use James 5:16, where it says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another. And once a week, you would get together with men, or you would get together with women, and you'd go around the circle and say, now, where did you struggle this week? Where are you failing God? And we would call that an accountability group. So here you've got this incredible discipleship program going. But he also did something innovative. He raised up an army of lay preachers called circuit riders. Up till this point, people thought that the only ones who could preach the gospel were people like Whitefield or Wesley, who were ordained, educated, they wore the right clergy clothes. He said, we're not going to get the job done with that. So he raised up a group of lay preachers. Now, he trained them. Whenever he sent them off on their horses, they had books in their saddlebags to read, and they had assignments to do. But he also gave them practical training. For instance, the poor in that day and time had no medical help available to them. They couldn't afford to go to a doctor. So he basically taught them the basics of medicine. We would call it first aid, but it was the basics of medicine to take care of the people in that day and time. But he also took care of the social needs of these new Christians. The converts that were getting saved came from the poorest part of society. Most of them had been alcoholics. That gin craze was devastating England. So when somebody got saved, they quit drinking. You know what happens when you quit drinking? You can now get a job, a job. You can take care of your family. And so, but the problem was, no bank would loan to these poor people, so you couldn't buy a house, you couldn't start a business. So what he did was he had every society begin a credit union, so that those who had been converted, had come out of sin, had seen their lives change, could have a way of making their lives better. Wesley also preached against one of the great evils of that day and time, which was slavery. Just a week before Wesley died, he sent a letter to William Wilberforce, who was fighting in Parliament to outlaw slavery. He said, you keep fighting until this battle is won. And Wilberforce kept that letter from Wesley in his coat pocket until finally, decades later, slavery was ended in the British Empire. Now, I mentioned briefly that I thought Wesley had a dysfunctional personality. We've seen that in some instances, but let me talk to you just briefly about his marriage. John and an entourage would travel around. And when I say an entourage, there would be a couple of women who traveled around because the women were there to take care of the women. That was the way you did things in that day and time, of course. And so they would travel on their horseback and go from place to place, sleep on the ground. It was quite a life. He fell in love with one of the ladies who was there to tend to the other ladies, a lady named Grace Murray, who proposed to her, and she accepted. But Charles was outraged, because Grace Murray was from the lower class of England, and they were from the upper class of England. So when John took off on his own to go on a preaching tour, Charles took Grace aside and said, this will destroy the Methodist movement if you marry John. And the only way we can prevent this from happening is you have to be married before John returns from his trip. So he found one of John's best friends, and he married that man to Grace Murray while John was on a several-week preaching trip. Can you imagine his shock when he came home and found that his fiancée was married to one of his friends, and the marriage was performed by his brother? They didn't speak for several years. But on the rebound, he took off. As he was traveling, he got sick in one town. He was in his late 40s. A widow who was in her early 40s took him into her home and said, I'll nurse you to health. And when he got stronger, he looked up at her and said, marry me now. He didn't want Charles to have a word in that, so they got married immediately. He said, now get on the horse. We're going to do the Lord's work. Well, she had never experienced that kind of life. She made one tour and said, that's not the life for me. And he coldly said, well, I must do the Lord's work. And basically paid her no more attention the rest of her life. They had a broken marriage. The only time he would see her, occasionally she would show up when he was preaching to a large crowd in the open field, and she would be the distressed woman at the edge of the crowd saying, don't listen to this man, he's a hypocrite. I know I'm married to him. So he had that dysfunctional nature that still was there in his life. By the way, one of his teachings that we'll revisit when we get to the history of the Pentecostals, is he taught that there was a second blessing possible where you could live an entirely holy life called sinless perfection. But to his credit, he claimed to have never experienced it in his life, and his wife would have agreed. Well, we've seen this great revival that has swept England, has swept America. But one of the things that you need to know is this revival brought division to the American Christians as well. Not everyone was enthusiastic about the revival that happened in these years of the 1700s. Every major American denomination split over the revival. The Presbyterians split between the new side, who were for it, and the old side. The Congregationalists, the denomination of Edwards, split between the New Lights and the Old Lights. The Baptists split between two groups, the regular Baptists and the separate Baptists. And the regular Baptists said, we don't like all this emotion, because I'll tell you what, folks, when you go out and you're preaching among the poor and they're getting gloriously saved, they're not going to be quiet about it. In fact, the Methodists originally were called shouting Methodists because they became such joyful Christians. And so those in the established churches on the East Coast said, we don't want that kind of thing in our churches. They didn't like this concept of lay preachers. And so they wanted their preachers to be educated, have decorum. Well, there were a couple of men who got saved in the revival up north who were congregational preachers who became Baptists. And by the way, many of those who got saved under Whitfield, even though Whitfield was a Church of England preacher, they became Baptists. In fact, he complained one day, all my chicks have become ducks. And part of the reason was we Baptists were already telling people, you must be born again before you can even become a member of a church. The gospel fit our way of doing church better than anyone else. So these two men came to North Carolina, to the country, Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall, and they formed the Sandy Creek Church along with the Sandy Creek Association. And they began to go out, especially they began to spread westward as the crowds moved from the East Coast over across the South, over into the West. And if you've noticed today, as you drive across the South and across the West, you'll find mainly Baptists and Methodists. You won't find as many Presbyterians. You won't find as many Episcopal. You won't find Congregationalists, those kind of things. And part of the reason was this, because those other denominations had strict requirements for who could be a pastor. You had to meet educational things. You had to be approved. You had to be sent out. Well, John Wesley said, you get called to preach, I'll give you a circuit. And the Baptist churches, what happened was this. They had no requirements for a pastor. If God called you to preach while you were behind a plow, you'd be in a pulpit the next Sunday. So since you had farmer preachers, as the people moved west, they'd simply have farmer preachers that God would raise up. And because of that, we were able to see this part of the country basically conquered by those two denominations. Now, I will say this as I close. We're in dark times like it was just before the Great Awakening, and my prayer is that we would see God do another revival like happened in the Great Awakening. So my assignment for you today, for your essay, is this. What can we learn from the Great Awakening that would help us in our day and time? Thank you for listening.